You can support me on Patreon for just $1 a month.
I always seem to avoid these kinds of videos because of the backlash, but what the heck. This is top 5 horror movie remakes that I prefer over the original. The first movie that I actually prefer over the original is The Blob, the 1998 remake that brought Shawnee Smith to our eyes. She was also in Saw years later. The Blob 1988 was just a pure 80s, in-your-face, bad A horror movie. The special effects were at the top of their game in that era of, practical real effects in 1988. We were getting close to CGI, but not there yet. And The Blob from 1988 was so amazing. I actually really have seen the original 1950s Blob, and for what it is, it's great. But with the technology that came through and in that 80s intensity, the 1998 Blob is just an absolute winner to me. The next remake that I want to say I definitely prefer, and I don't think this is a very controversial one. There are 2 controversial ones on my list, but the next one is John Carpenter's The Thing. I will also go on record and say this. I think that John Carpenter's The Thing is the best horror movie he ever made. As iconic and as great as Halloween is and what it did for the horror genre, The Thing is one movie that was a lot more. To get up back on the subject really quick, this remake was more like the original story. Now the original The Thing from Outer Space was more of its own deal, but John Carpenter's was really more closely related to the origins of the actual story of The Thing. The reason that The Thing is so good is because I have never seen a movie that was even remotely like it before, and you can't ever touch that movie. It's so perfect. Holds up to this day. Probably better than most of the movies that are out now anyway. The next movie on our list that is probably a controversial choice, but maybe not. 1986 is, I believe, David Cronenberg's The Fly. Jeff Goldblum was so amazing in this movie. Once again, it's these practical effects. It was a perfected art form. In the mid-80s, the effects in The Fly are some of the greatest effects I think I have ever seen in a horror movie. Till this day, the story is great. It's science fiction, but it's not a snooze. It's not a bore. It really keeps you in tune. And Jeff Goldblum's character is like a creep. You're really interested in him, and you're not sure why. There's something about his character, whether it was just the portrayal from him or the writing itself. Not a discrepancy in this movie, in my opinion. The Fly in 1986 is the greatest Fly movie in the world. The next 2 remakes are controversial, but I do prefer them. That's not to say that I think they are better. I just enjoy watching these more. The 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, I know Texas Chainsaw Massacre is an absolute classic. It predates Halloween. It's one of those movies that will never be forgotten. I just really enjoy the 2003 remake. I'm not saying it's better, but if I'm going to watch one, 9 times out of 10, I'll pick the 2003 remake. I just thought it was done really good. And then the last remake I prefer over the original, may be the most controversial, but I gotta be honest, the 1990 version of Night of the Living Dead. The original is an all-time classic. There's no disputing that. But the Tom Savini 1990 version, I just enjoy it so much. Once again, the heartbeat before CGI. All these effects have come into play. All the learning, all the tools that Savini and his team learned. It just came to a peak, and this was it. And then the effects in 1990's Night of the Living Dead were incredible. The makeup was insane. And Tony Todd did a fantastic job in this movie. He was so good. And that's just another thing I want to say is I just love Tony Todd's performance so much. So the 1990 version of Night of the Living Dead is my favorite #1 remake of all time. That's my list. Do you guys agree with anything I said on this list, or do you highly disagree? If you do, that's fine. Just don't cuss me out in the comments. Just explain to me what you see different from me. I'd love to get you guys' perspective on things. But this is Christian Hanna Horror, with hopefully not too much of a controversial vid, but a vid nonetheless. So let me know what you guys think in the comment sections, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.